And one of them is that the Inland Valley Civil War Roundtable is going to be having a talk by Gary Gallagher in just a couple of weeks. And oh, that was weird.
Oh, I just changed it so we can see you better. So I just
okay.
took the focus off my screen.
Yes, the strange thing was it changed my screen when you did that in a very peculiar way. Anyway, so the Inland Valley people are having Gary Gallagher as their guest speaker 2 weeks from tonight. And later in the meeting, I will put the contact information for that in the chat. The reason I'm waiting is because anyone who arrives after I put it in won't be able to see the link. So we'll see about sending out an email also before that meeting, but it's not apparently going to be the same talk he gave us. He's got a lot of things he can talk about for some funny reason. So
Nick, we have a couple of people on the call tonight from Inland Empire. If they want to say anything about the meeting, Brian, their program chair is on.
Oh, great.
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so yes, it's true. On June 8th, we have Gary Gallagher will be talking at the Inland Empire Civil War Roundtable via Zoom. And if you email us, there's our email address. Inland Empire, so iecwrt@gmail.com. If you email us at that, we will send you our link. Mike Hoover there below me on the screen will send you a link to that meeting. And he's going to be talking about Gettysburg, and he's sort of going to give us a reassessment of Gettysburg sort of viewed through the 2021. And so we're really looking forward to that. That's going to be a great presentation. So thank you for announcing that. We really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Oh, sure. Well, we really hope that things get built back up out there because we know how difficult that is.
Absolutely.
Also, because some of you have been attending the various Memorial Day events over the years, I want you to know that there are small Memorial Day ceremonies at a number of the cemeteries in Southern California that have Civil War graves. But because of the restrictions and because it's not June 15th yet, they're not going to be the big celebrations that have been around in years past. However, if any of you have been reading the articles in the LA Times about the cemetery down in the Compton area that was being restored and the Civil War graves there, that's one of the ones this year where there's going to be a small ceremony in honor of the Civil War graves there. Next year, I expect there to be full-scale ceremonies at Mountain View and several of the other cemeteries. But this year, it's okay to go and visit, but don't expect there to be any large gatherings because they're still being discouraged. At Mountain View, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War are going to be marking some of the graves, but not as in-depth this year because as far as I know, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts are not going to be helping out, which means it's a lot of work to decorate all of those graves. Because up at Mountain View, there are about 700 Civil War graves that we've identified. So it's a little tricky for 2 or 3 people to do that. But anyway, there will be ceremonies at some of the cemeteries scattered throughout Southern California. If you want to go and visit them, that's great, but don't expect a big deal this year. We're not going to have reenactors or speeches or things like that at any of the ones that I'm aware of. As some of you know, we are starting to think in terms of next calendar year, because by then we hope to be able to start meeting in person again. However, for those of you who have also been following the news, the Pasadena Central Library is not going to be available for us to use the auditorium there. What came out in the news earlier this month is that the builders of that building did what I can only call as a catastrophic oopsie in terms of not necessarily following the design plans. And so the support pillars that are keeping the different levels apart are only structurally sound versus the force of gravity. That means if there was an earthquake causing a rolling motion of that building, they did some quick studies about a month ago and realized there's nothing keeping the first floor up above or below the second floor because those pillars aren't going to hold up the difference. And the concrete facings of the building are apparently also not correctly supported. So if you were walking out of the building and an earthquake happened, you could become very flat. So the Pasadena Central Library is not inhabitable at the moment. And based on the information that we've received so far, I wouldn't count on it being available to us for probably 3 to 4 years minimum. Because if they have to go to a bond issue to do the repair work, and that seems like it's a strong possibility, they cannot do the bond vote until November of next year. And then they're estimating 2 years of actual structural work on the building after funding is guaranteed. The library is looking for a temporary home, but it is unlikely that the temporary home will include a large meeting space. So we're looking for other options. There are some that are available, and it's just a question of price versus utility. And that's what we're looking at because we've outgrown the smaller meeting spaces that we used to use because we're really popular now and we get good attendance and lots of people and major speakers, and those don't fit into the places that this group used to meet back in the 80s and 90s. I will tell you that even if we were allowed to use it, the room that we used in the 1980s can only comfortably hold about 25 adults. So that just isn't going to cut it. Anyway, those are the pieces of news we have for you this evening. And now I'm going to hand things over to Janet to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Nick. Just to add on to what Nick has said, if any of you have or know of suggestions of meeting places in Pasadena that you are familiar with, or the churches that you attend that might have large halls for meeting space, please do let us know at our email address, Pasadena Civil War, CWRT@gmail.com. We will follow up on each and every lead and try and find ourselves a good meeting place for hopefully a target date of January of 2022 to start meeting in person again. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker. Steve Phan is a park ranger and historian at the Civil War Defenses of Washington. He served as the acting chief of interpretation at Camp Nelson National Monument, which, as you may remember, Nick gave a talk about a couple of months ago, and at Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers National Monument. He has worked at Richmond National Battlefield Park, Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, Stones River National Battlefield, and Rock Creek Park. He is the author of articles about Asians and Pacific Islanders in the Civil War and the Defenses of Washington for numerous publications. And he was nominated for the National Park Service Tilden Award for Excellence in Interpretation in 2019. He holds a master's degree in American history from Middle Tennessee State University. And Steve, we welcome you to the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable.
Well, thank you, Janet. I appreciate the introduction there. Hello, everyone. I'm on the East Coast, so it's this is the latest program I think I've ever done. I'm originally from Colorado, so I understand the time difference. And by the way, for everyone in Pasadena, I know the Rose Bowl is there, but I'm a fanatical Colorado Buffaloes fan, so I'm used to watching Colorado football games at 11 p.m. Eastern time. So thank you for the invite to present at the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable. As Janet said, my name is Steve Phan. I'm a historian and park ranger at the Civil War Defenses of Washington in D.C. We manage the historic earthworks that were constructed to protect the Capitol during the Civil War. But, you know, I've had the great fortune to work at national parks around the country and really dive into all the really unique and complex stories. And when I was in graduate school at Middle Tennessee State, I got introduced to some historians in the Park Service and was asked to participate in this publication we did for the 150th. And that's really led with me pursuing kind of my interest, obviously, in Asian and Pacific Islanders, and then my own background as well. So let's get started from there. It's kind of interesting, right? I mean, it's 2021. Can you believe it's the 160th of the American Civil War, 1861? So I've been really focusing a lot of my programming on 1861 in Washington, D.C. But I've also, as Janet said, I spent the last 4 months as the chief of interp at Camp Nelson National Monument, one of the newest National Park Service units. And then, I just got back to DC a couple of weeks ago, and I'm diving back into the Civil War fortifications, obviously the Battle of Fort Stevens coming up in July, and then topics like this since it's Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So I'm going to share my screen right now and get started. All right, so I call this Fighting for Citizenship, and you're going to see me talk about citizenship quite a bit throughout this program here. And we're going to talk about, obviously, Asian and Pacific Islanders and the Civil War, and a topic we may not have talked about 20 years ago, even as the early 2000s. But as we shifted towards the Civil War 150th starting in 2011, the Park Service, took a very assertive role in kind of what I call amplifying the voices of the past. And so we did quite a bit of publications, and these publications featured stories of people often kind of unknown or unrelated to in regards to the Civil War. There was publication on American Indians, Hispanics, African Americans, and they were literally published each year, 2011, 12, 13, and 14, and 15. And the Asian and Pacific Islanders one actually did really, really well. And you're going to see this. And we had our old director, John Jarvis, really talk about, this publication, which he was, really proud to be a part of since he was the director when it was published. And, it's the enduring legacy of Asians and Pacific Islanders is their battle for civil rights. And as I said, this is going to be kind of the underlying theme of this program here. And you're going to see what I'm talking about as I move forward with this. As I said, the Park Service released a series of handbooks highlighting the stories and perspectives of people, often missing in this war's memory, interpretation, and historiography. The one about Asian and I'll just say API came out in 2015 to wide acclaim. If you went to Battlefield's Civil War ones managed by the Park Service, publication was sold in the bookstores in 2015, maybe 2016, but they sold out almost within the year, and they're actually out of print right now. And I can show you what that looks like. You'll have a better view of the publication when I go forward in the program here. And so this is a part of the publication here. I mean, we're going to talk about people that were involved in the conflict and the struggle, that they faced in the years after the Civil War, which I think is critically important. And as we really dive into the 160th of the Civil War, I really see this interpretation really expanding to really understand, the post-war nuances of people, really soldiers coming home and kind of their struggle to, regain the sense of themselves. Obviously, the struggle of prisoners of war, obviously people of color, African Americans, post-Civil War, kind of a calibration of reconstruction, reevaluation, right? This is all a part of it. And so it's a very exciting time to work at Civil War park sites across the country. And this is just a part of the, really just one small piece of part of the narrative here. So I'm going to start with this. And I know this is a different Civil War, but this is one that kind of inspires me to really talk about APIs and American military history, okay? So, and this relates to my background and my family. And this has been one of my great inspirations is, and you're going to see what I mean by this. And I love this quote, which I came across from General Jung. He served with the South Vietnamese Army. And he wrote this in his after action kind of report on basically the end of the Vietnam War. The average South Vietnamese soldier who grew up in war was not only audacious and devoted to the cause for which he had been fighting, but he always took pride in his character. career, and his heart was filled with love for his family, his comrade in arms, and his people. He is indeed a heroic warrior who represented the noblest traditions of the Vietnamese people, a most ardent patriot, and an outstanding soldier. And why does this inspire me? Well, my father served in the South Vietnamese military. My family is from Vietnam. My parents fled Vietnam in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and the South Vietnamese government. And you can imagine growing up as a student of history, I was intrigued by my parents' past, especially by my father's military experience, but he never talked about it. He hardly acknowledged that he served in the war. And you can imagine some of the things that he had to endure. He was just 19 years old when he fled Vietnam, and it took him years to get back to visit his family. So displaced, going to a new country, imagine some of the horrors he saw on the battlefield. And so at that young age, I can imagine why, looking back now, I understand why it was so difficult for him to even talk about his service in Vietnam. But I came across, we know about South Vietnam, the fall of Saigon. And so I've always been interested in the Civil War since a very young age, even in Colorado. And I'm so happy to present to a Civil War roundtable, not only west of the Mississippi, but, the Trans-Mississippi Theater way out west, right, on the Pacific coast. Because I understand, my family and their friends in Colorado didn't ever really talk about the war. They didn't know each other in Vietnam, but they came together as a community in Denver as refugees. And so I was always very intrigued by, our past and, where we came from. As I said, my father didn't talk very much about this, but there was things that kind of revealed more evidence that I came across in my years growing up that really inspired me. And so this was one of them. This is an image of my father, who served in the South Vietnamese Navy. As I said, he was just 19 years old when he fled South Vietnam in 1975. And I came across this about, 10 or 12 years ago, in a cupboard somewhere in my father's home in Colorado. And it kind of blew me away. And, he wore a necklace, a naval necklace, a pendant around his neck growing up. And he basically acknowledged twice that he had served in the war. But that was it. No details, no mention of his service at all. And when I came across this photo, obviously I was very proud, intrigued, and inspired as well. And, as a historian of the Civil War, I'd been studying it for quite some time, but I really never made the correlation between my family's Civil War and the American Civil War until I saw this picture here. Probably the most famous person of Asian descent that served in the Civil War, named Joseph Pierce. A very vivid image of a young man that served in the Civil War, served for the U.S. Army. And, this became the cover for the MPS publication. And he's really become the most well-known API that served in the Civil War. And it's become, for me, kind of one of my inspirations to dive into this topic. And I don't think you're surprised, but he may be from China, Joseph Pierce is. My father's from Vietnam, but I see my father in him, around the same age, fighting in a war, and really displaced, right? I mean, Joseph Pierce enlisted with the Connecticut Regiment, I believe that. And so what was he fighting for? Well, we'll talk about this in this topic moving forward here. So this is kind of my inspiration, right? Understanding my family's Civil War, our family conflict, really has opened my eyes in understanding the American Civil War, how complex it was, how really there was people from all parts of the world that served in the Civil War in a variety of different roles. And that what brings me here today. So this is a part of the publication from 2015. And I don't want to get too deep into the text here, but it's called Another Civil War. And that's what I've been kind of talking about, understanding my family's history and their Civil War by understanding the American Civil War. So I was really able to dive deep and kind of understand the nuances of this. And as I said, when I saw Joseph Pierce's picture, I said, wow, maybe I do have a role in interpreting and understanding the Civil War. And that's really led me forward since that period. So what about Joseph Pierce? I think it's a great way to lead off with him. Well, according to the chaplain, our Joe, as we called him, was really off duty, a brave, capable, and faithful soldier. And I think it's important to start with Joseph Pierce because he's the best well-known soldier of the war in regards to being of Asian descent. And his story, his background is mirrored by many, many people from Asia that came to North America during this period, really from the 1830s until 1870s, 80s, until the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Who was Joseph Pierce? I think that's a very important question. Well, there's the cover to the publication there. As you can imagine, people were drawn by this, right? It's very dramatic. It's a very vivid image of this young soldier who served heroically at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. He was he was with the 14th Connecticut with Pickett's charge on repelling Pickett's charge on July 3rd near the Bliss Farm, and served well enough to get promoted to the rank of corporal. But who was this person? Who was this man? Where did he come from? What about his family, right? I think when a lot of people see this image, these questions start arising, right? It really inspires this curiosity. Well, we know that he was 21 years old when he enlisted with the 14th Connecticut in August of 1862. But it's really important to understand his backdrop. And there's a couple of different stories about how he came to the United States. One said that story said that he was sold by his father to an American ship captain named Amos Peck. Another story said that his brother sold him. And this was not an uncommon thing for a lot of Chinese people that had multiple children. They just couldn't afford them, right? And imagine all the transportation and trade that was going on between Europe and North America, South America, and parts of Asia, right? This is really picking up, especially with steamships. And so, that route to Asia, which seemed very impossible decades before, or it took so long to do that, was you could do that within a few weeks now, right? And so, not a surprise here. But apparently, he was about 10 years old when he came to the U.S., brought to Connecticut, kind of grew up in the New Britain area of Connecticut as a farmer. And he stayed with Peck's family. And apparently he took the last name Pierce for Franklin Pierce, the American president, and then would go on to serve with valor with the 14th Connecticut, served in kind of different roles within the regiment, from a cook to a frontline soldier, as I mentioned before, involved in Pickett's charge, or the repulse of Pickett's charge. According to the regimental history, his appearance was pigtail and all, the only Chinese soldier in the Army of the Potomac. But history will show that he was not the only soldier from China or of Chinese descent, and there were actually many other soldiers from parts of Asia that were involved in this conflict. I think it's important to understand. Here's a really great image of him. This is in the regimental history there. You can see the text, the only, and I'm using a term they used back then, of course, Chinamen enlisted in the Army of the Potomac, which you'll see me mention moving forward. That is not true. And I think importantly, you can see him right here on the left in the middle here. Joseph Pierce was naturalized as a U.S. citizen in 1866. So when we talk about citizenship, what exactly are these people fighting for? As we Civil War enthusiasts and buffs and historians know, each person fought for individual goals, right? Individual motivations. It kind of depended on who they were, who their family was, right? Where they were from, and like kind of their status in life, right? So this would range for the people of Asian descent as well. But Joseph Pierce talked about his abhorrence for slavery and wanting to show his new country that he deserved to be a citizen, right? And that was one of the really great motivations for him enlisting. So when we talk about Asians and Pacific Islanders, we really have to start with Joseph Pierce, and then we can dive a little bit deeper, especially when they say, there's only one person of Asian descent that served in the Army, and we know for sure that that's not true. And there it is. Department of Labor, and he moved to the Superior Hartford area after the Civil War. And you can see he was naturalized March of 1866. And it's kind of it says, his birth country of birth or allegiance is China, but after this, he becomes a naturalized citizen. And by the way, I think it's very critically important to understand that this was not exactly common for all people of Asian descent in this of being naturalized. It would be a very difficult journey for a good amount of people. And you'll see one I mentioned specifically towards the end of the program here. And there's his grave, taken by my friend who actually used to portray Joseph Pierce in living history programs. But I apologize, I don't recall the name of the cemetery, but you can find it on Find a Grave. It's at a cemetery in Connecticut. But there he is. And if you want to go visit him, please do. But as you can see, there's that image of him right there. And so really, he's gained a lot of popularity in the past 20 years or so. Okay, so what's so important about this? Well, historians have identified 300 people of Asian descent that served in the American Civil War. And I actually think that's a fairly low number. And why is that a low number? Because of this. The 1860 census, which you can only identify yourself by 3 different words or terms or colors, as we could say: white, Black, or Milano. So we're going to really dive deep into what that means, because as I said, Asian and Pacific Islanders have been, in the United States for quite some time before the Civil War, with shipping and produce and trade. Many worked on sugar plantations in the Pacific and the Caribbean islands, and even parts of the American South. You might have heard of the word coolie, Coolie, or IES for plural. They were really low-wage workers on farms, plantation, mines, docks, and other businesses. So you're going to hear the word coolie or the coolie trade quite a bit. And we can identify them from all over the place, from Calcutta and Java, Japan, India, Hong Kong, the Philippine Islands, Siam, the East Indies, of course, China, Singapore. I mean, we're talking all parts of Asia and the Asian subcontinent as well. And of course, being in California, I'm sure you're all well aware of, the California mining fields and gold and silver in the 1850s and under other industries with restaurants and shops and things like that. There was a small population east of the Mississippi, and we'll talk about that when the war begins. So what about the 1860 census? Well, accordingly, there was 37,000 people of Chinese descent in California. 37,000 in California. Nearly 35,000 those were men, okay? What about east of the Mississippi? About 200 people of Chinese descent, so obviously a very, very low number, located in the north, mostly in the Northeast. And for people of other Asian descent, Japan, Philippines, India, Thailand, and Malaysia was around 500. So east of the Mississippi River, maybe 700-800 people. Could be more. You can imagine not everyone signs up to do the U.S. Census, as we know even today, right? But what about this? So the census taker was responsible for assigning race, right? And of course, their perceptions and views were varied, really on the person that was taking down the information. So let me give you an example. In Louisiana, Chinese people were classified as white. In Massachusetts, Chinese were classified as mulatto, which actually makes quite a bit of sense if you think about it. Think about Louisiana, which is a slave state, right? If you want to kind of separate the races, especially with enslaved African Americans, those are, Black and mulatto, and then Chinese are considered white. I mean, that's interesting to see that separation. And then in Massachusetts, where, there's a small Black population, but obviously nothing like the enslaved population in the South, Chinese were considered mulatto. And I'm sure that means different, right? They're not Black. They're certainly not white. So, they're different. And so I've always kind of been intrigued by that as well. And so, that's kind of the thing we have to understand here. We know of at least 300 that historians have identified that served in the armies and navies in the war. Imagine how many more, especially think about this with anglicized names. Joseph Pierce, we didn't have a photo of him or people didn't describe who he was. Joseph Pierce could be anyone, right? And you're going to see other names of people of Asian descent who changed their name or anglicized their names, either coming to the U.S. or even before that when they were baptized or, went through some sort of religious conversion. So this was not uncommon. And so, just a recruiting poster here. And so if you've seen enlistment papers, you see the same thing, the recruiting sergeant, has descriptions for these soldiers, and sometimes it literally says complexion, light, dark, mixed. What exactly does that mean? We're not necessarily sure. It really comes down to the person writing this down, right? So imagine, in the coming years when we digitize more documents and do more research, well, I have no doubt we'll discover more people of Asian descent that served in the military. And so just examples here of, just some recruiting posters, and just imagine the tens of thousands of men that enlisted from all over the place. You can imagine there were people from all different parts of the world that enlisted. We know that for sure. And men of color, we'll certainly talk about that moving forward, because believe it or not, there were people of Asian descent that served in the United States colored troops, which was really a kind of eye-opening learning experience for me. I had no idea that happened. So from sea to shining sea, the Civil War is an isolated military, social, or political conflict. People from all across the world came to the United States to participate. And they were here, obviously, the decades before the Civil War as well. As I said, what about the armies and navies? As historians have identified dozens and dozens. Of that number, 50 to 100 or so, according to historians of Asian descent, served in the U.S. Navy. And here's an example right here. I mean, that would make sense. Think about where all these ships are going across the country. I mean, there was, African Americans serving on U.S. Navy ships long before the Emancipation Proclamation, long before, any sort of passage of emancipation or any, confiscation acts and things like that, because, you're on these ports and you're out at sea, and they need as many men as they can to help really manage these ships, right? And so the majority of these soldiers will be serving on the seas, which is not a surprise. I think people were often shocked to understand that, there's American ships in the Caribbean and out in the Pacific during the Civil War. They're not all just doing blockade duty around the coast in the Eastern Theater and then the South, around the southern states. They're all over the place. Europe, even parts of the Indian Ocean and things like that. So we know of a group of Pacific Islanders, especially from Hawaii, we believe, that served on the USS Santiago de Cuba. And they saw action at the Second Battle of Fort Fisher in January of 1865 off the Cape Fear in North Carolina, obviously one of the most important seaports for the Confederacy, especially for ships going towards Europe. And we also know of Filipino soldiers that served on the CSS Confederate Gains at the Battle of Mobile Bay in August of 1864. So as I move forward in this program here, I'm trying to identify broadly how many people served and kind of where they came from, but I'm also going to provide specific examples of who we know served. So I call the soldiers in blue and gray. Well, there's this gentleman right here. You can see his name again with his anglicized name, right? Because his name was Thomas Sylvanus. He was born in Hong Kong in 1845. His Chinese name is Yi Wei. So imagine, if you were looking up the records here and all you saw was his name, you'd probably scroll right by it. Enlisted in a couple of regiments, actually. Originally with the 81st Pennsylvania, and later he re-enlisted with the 42nd New York Volunteers, which you can see on his headstone there. And according to the 1860 census, he was in a household in Baltimore, Maryland, and he was a servant, served as a servant, and apparently the people that, he worked for allowed him to serve in the U.S. Army during the Civil War. And then after the war, he moved out on his own and raised a family. And there's a really interesting account of him, actually, and I'd like to read it to you from the Gettysburg Compiler. And listen to the date here, April 5th, 1882. So historians have been able to find really great accounts in the newspapers. And again, newspapers and accounts want to obviously, say, we're the first, right? This guy was the first. And we always heard of Joseph Pierce as the first person of Chinese descent that served. Well, not according to the Gettysburg compiler. They said he was actually the first Chinaman ever naturalized in America, and he now lives in Indiana and Pennsylvania. He is perhaps the only one of his race who carried a musket throughout the Civil War, which we, of course, know is not true. But this is important. He's now on the pension list and drawing a pension for injuries received during the war, and has been a voter for a few years. So he was a citizen at that point. The Albany Times in New York in 1884 said, Thomas Sylvanus, besides being the only Chinaman in that county, claims the distinction of being the only Chinaman in the United States who saw service, draws a pension, and votes. Tom is somewhat between 40 and 50 years old and came to this country at the age of 9. He enlisted in the 81st Pennsylvania, and during the engagement received injuries to his eyes, for which he draws a pension of $12 a month. So that's kind of interesting, right? And soldiers had to make claims, for their service. So if Thomas Sylvanus says, I'm the only, Chinaman in quotes that served in the Union Army, I understand why he proclaimed that, right? I'm sure he wanted to get as much compensation as he could for his military service. So another example there, and you can see he died in 1891. So we have the Army of the Potomac, a couple guys that served in, of course, the mighty Eastern Army. But there's a gentleman like this that served in another unit. I'm particularly interested about his service. Private Wu Hong Nyok. He actually served, listen to this, the 50th Pennsylvania Infantry Emergency Militia. And when were these units organized? June and July of 1863. Yes, in response to the Pennsylvania invasion by Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia, which we know leads to the Battle of Gettysburg. Well, this guy's got a very interesting, really background. Born in 1834 in Shangzhou, and he's going to make his way over to the U.S. because he'll be baptized by a bishop from the American Church Mission, and he's going to really relocate to the United States, live in Pennsylvania, live in Lancaster, which is about an hour east of Gettysburg, which I was there this past weekend, actually. And he's going to be there working under this bishop for quite some time. And he's going to be with these different American families until the war begins. And actually, it's really interesting. He actually, waits until the Gettysburg campaign to even enlist, and it's only for temporary service. And after that, he goes back to the church. But accordingly, for some of the research I found, he was actually a naturalized citizen, or naturalized on September 22nd, 1860, very early, obviously before the Civil War. And the only person of Chinese descent naturalized in Lancaster County at the time. And then he'll go on after his military service back to the church, even going back to China to be a missionary. But I want to read you his account of why he volunteered to serve, okay? As I said, volunteered starting in late June and was mustered out of service on August 15th, 1863. So very short-term emergency service. As we know, there's a lot of units around the country that did that during the Civil War. And listen to what he said. I volunteered on June 29th, 1863, in spite of the advice of my Lancaster friends against it, for I had felt that the North was right in opposing slavery. My friends thought I should not join the militia and risk my life in war, for my own people and family were in China, and I had neither property nor family in Americas whose defense might serve as an excuse for my volunteering. I mean, that's a very powerful statement from Mr. Wu here in regards to why he enlisted, right? And I think it's incredibly powerful. But I said he ends up going back to China and will die in 1919. I believe he is buried in China. I could not find his grave in the U.S., which actually does make sense, okay? So we've got different elements. We talked about the Navy. We talked about the Army of the Potomac. We talked about this famous militia group or emergency militia company or regiment. And we'll talk about the Confederate soldiers as well. Well, listen to this. At least 18 soldiers in Confederates Louisiana units had names like this: True and Ding and Fei and Fu and Gong, Ho. Who knows exactly, exactly where these people were from, but imagine how diverse Louisiana was, especially around the coastal area, which people of Asian descent had been there for decades, especially in New Orleans. So this is not a surprise here. And so we hope to dive in more and people can find out more about who these people were. Well, I think the most famous family that was involved from the South were these two gentlemen. They actually did not serve in the military, but their sons did. And this is Chang and Eng Bunker. I'm sure people that are watching this or viewing this might have heard for them before, because they were the famed P.T. Barnum Circus renowned Siamese twins. Okay. And when the war began, I don't want to dive too much into kind of their circus type career, which is apparently they were some of the most prominent. They're, according to what I was researching, they're the most prominent, famous people of Asian descent in the entire country in the 19th century or the late 19th century. But they did well, and they became farmers in North Carolina. Their property include enslaved people, including about 20, we believe, when the war began in 1861. They believe they were adopting values of the southern planters. Okay, and so and they married some local North Carolina white women, and they had sons that served in this. Okay, so one son, Chang's son Christopher, served in the 37th Battalion of the Virginia Cavalry. He was wounded and captured in West Virginia and spent several months in a Union prisoner camp. Prisoner of war camp, excuse me. And how popular were them? Well, they kind of used their example to do this political poster. And this is actually for the 1860 election with, you can see McClellan and Pendleton there running for the Democrats. It's really interesting. And according to the description, it says the cartoon objects to the 1864 Democratic ticket that combined two men with differing views. George Pendleton opposed the Civil War. George McClellan did not support a ceasefire. You know, one thing about McClellan, he repudiated the Democratic platform, which called for peace if they won the election, right? And so it's kind of interesting. This was featured on one of the sites, talking about these Siamese twins. And so that's kind of interesting. You got two, people looking directly at each other, and do they really mean the same thing? Do they want the same thing? So the Republican supporters jumped on this, and they combined McClellan and Pendleton at the the waist or the hip, and they used that as a political poster. Very, very interesting. Who else is there? Well, I'll mention this other soldier as well. Before I get to United States Colored Troops, there was a guy named Charles Chan who served. He was a Chinese national, served as a private in Company K. 24th Texas Dismounted Cav. He was actually killed at the Battle of Franklin in November of 1864 and is buried at the McGavock Confederate Cemetery. I'm sure a lot of people have been there. It's a really wonderful cemetery. And actually, one of the most prominent one I found is George Founty, Founty, a native of China. He was a cigar maker in Savannah, Georgia when the war broke out. And it's kind of interesting, he one of those guys that kind of waited till end of the war. And from what I found, he was conscripted before he joined the Confederate Army there in 1864. And according to some of the notes I found, the last Confederate Conscription Act brought John under the rule, and he was accordingly notified, determined not to fight anymore under the rebel flag. He seized the first favorable opportunity to make his escape to St. Augustine. And unsurprisingly, he has an account of Jefferson Davis, like a lot of federal soldiers have accounts of Abraham Lincoln. And this was apparently when he was leaving Savannah as Jeff Davis was trying to escape. He said he ran into Jefferson Davis and he asked him, "When will the war be over?" Apparently Jefferson Davis responded, "Don't, for heaven's sake, ask me such a question. Not until the Yankees give up." So that's kind of an interesting account. Obviously, it's likely apocryphal, but it kind of gives you an idea of kind of the range and scope of the men that served in the Confederacy as well. All right. What about United States colored troops? I think this is very interesting. Well, we just had the anniversary for the establishment of the United States colored troops, the Bureau for Colored Troops, which was established in late or kind of mid-May, May 18th. Actually, it was the other day, right? It is May 25th. It happened this past Saturday, actually, when the War Department authorized the recruitment of African-American soldiers for the United States Army. And the first unit was actually raised in Washington, D.C., the first United States colored troops. But according to research, historians have identified some soldiers of Asian descent who enlisted with the USCT, including 2 Hawaiian soldiers who served in the 41st USCT. And there was also another gentleman that served in the 5th Regiment Massachusetts Colored Volunteer Cav. We also have a name of one as well. Unfortunately, we don't have his image. There was a Joseph Pascal. He was from East India over in the South Asian subcontinent, served with the 31st USCT, and he was the regiment was raised in New York City and combined with the 30th Connecticut Volunteers. And so how would, troops enlist with United States colored troops? Well, hey, we had the census right before with the different identifications that people could claim, black, white, or mulatto. And I think it's very interesting. I mean, there's some historians that have claimed that they had to enlist in the USCT because white regiments wouldn't recruit them. Obviously, we know that's not true by this many examples that we just listed here. I just think it was an opportunity, depending on where they were at across, in the country, where the recruiting station was. Recruiters themselves are under a lot of pressure to bring, recruits into camp, into the regiment itself to form these new companies. So I think for a lot of these people, it was just an opportunity, depending kind of where they were at. And maybe if they had a darker complexion, they were able to enlist if other regiments were saying, no, we're full, right? And so I don't think that's a surprise here. And I'm sure we have at least 180,000 that served in the Union armies, more in the navies, up to 210,000 African Americans. Supposedly, not supposedly, the number of USCTs is about 210,000. How many could be of Asian descent? I'm thinking dozens, if not more. So stay tuned, and who knows, we might be able to find more. And so I think this is one of the most famous images of African American soldiers, and this is actually my favorite images of Black soldiers during the Civil War. Why? Because this is actually in Washington, D.C. at Fort Lincoln, one of our defensive sites, one of the earthworks or fortifications. And I just wanted to give an idea. I think people, when they see the images of Black soldiers, it's very powerful, right? But, maybe we'll come across more images or diaries or letters about people of Asian descent, because it's interesting because, the regiments certainly wrote about them in the regimental histories. Maybe we'll find more in some of the diaries and letters home, even the newspapers moving forward. It kind of just depends on what we find. Okay, so war, peace, and the, I call this the post-war fight for citizenship. And I got to talk about a specific soldier here. And I think this is very important to understand. As I mentioned earlier, we have guys like Joseph Pierce and Thomas Savanas and Mr. Fu that gained their citizenship, were naturalized as citizens. Well, that wasn't the case for everyone. And here is a perfect example of this. And this was Edward Kohota from China. Came over to the United States at a certain age. We're not exactly sure when. He enlisted with the 23rd Massachusetts Infantry. Said he was about 15 years of age. Actually, much like Joseph Pierce's story, he was brought over by an American ship captain named Sergeant Day, and he arrived in New England, Gloucester, Massachusetts, and he was raised part of this seafaring town and likely worked on the docks and things like that. Saw battle on action on many Virginia battlefields, including Cold Harbor. Apparently, he dragged a wounded comrade to safety. And then after the Civil War, He returned to Massachusetts, but was unable to find work. So what did Edward do? Well, like a lot of people, including African Americans, in 1866, the U.S. Army was reorganized to include 45 new regiments, or 45 total regiments, including 6 black regiments. We now know those as the Buffalo Soldiers. Those are later reorganized to 4, 9th, 10th Cav, 24th, and 25th Infantry. Kahota did not enlist with the Buffalo Soldiers, but he did, this is very important, my friends, enlist with the 15th U.S. Infantry. This is the regular army. They served out west, campaigns against Native Americans, guarding the railroad, occupation duty, all the way up until, you know, the Northwest, the Nez Perce, everything that they did back there. Obviously, they were maintaining forts. He was at Fort Union in New Mexico. They actually feature his story there. And listen to this. He re-enlisted in the 15th U.S. Infantry for the next 30 years. And till he finally retired in Nebraska in 1894. Apparently, he opened a restaurant in Valentine, Nebraska. Married a woman there, gave birth. They had 6 children. Unfortunately, lost his restaurant to a fire in 1910. But unfortunately, you know, the really sad part of this story was, despite his decades of military service, he was never naturalized as a U.S. citizen. So he could not vote. And he will be very upset about that for really the rest of his life, understandably. And then he'll, you know, return to Massachusetts toward the end of his life. And then he'll retire to Hot Springs, South Dakota at a veteran's home. And listen to this. He dies in 1935 in his 90s, and he was still not granted his U.S. citizenship. And that continues to this day. So perhaps we can build some momentum to have Mr. Edward Kahota, be naturalized as a U.S. citizen. I think that would be absolutely proper. And here's an image of him towards the end of his life. So from the Civil War to the regular army, which a lot of people did, not only the officers, as I said, you know, this actually reminds me, as Janet mentioned, I worked at Buffalo Soldiers National Monument at Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers in Ohio. And the first generation and second generation of the Buffalo Soldiers were mostly Civil War veterans, Black Civil War veterans that had served in the United States colored troops. And really, it was a practical decision, right? The Army offered steady pay and benefits, and they could take care of their families as well. And many re-enlisted for 20 or 30 years. And when I was reading his account, it reminded me of the Buffalo Soldiers, right? I mean, there's a reason why he served there for so long in the regular Army. He could feed himself, he could take care of his family, and he could get some sort of retirement after extensive service on the frontier. So listen to this. Check this out. And it's kind of hard to read. I'll read it out loud. Kahota's claim to citizenship, Chicago, Illinois, December 20th, 1890. So, I mean, hell, he had decades more to live before he passed away. There is a Chinaman in the United States who has a claim to citizenship that it's hardly probable any court will deny. Listen to that. He's called Edward de Kahota, and he is serving in Company H of the 15th Infantry at Fort Sheridan. According to his story, his name is Moy. He was born in Shanghai in 1848. When 6 years old, he was brought on board the ship Kahota from Boston, commanded by Captain S.S. Day. So you see where he got his last name. Here he served as a cabin boy and claims to have discovered that he was the son of Captain Day, his mother being a Chinese woman of rank. That's kind of interesting. Who knows if that's true, right? As we know, soldiers and widows and family members, they'll do as much as they can when they make these claims for pensions and things like that. And his is different, right? He's claiming citizenship. A few years later, Captain Day took him into his family and sent him to school. At the breaking out of the war, he went to the front and served through it in the 23rd Massachusetts Volunteers, Colonel Ewell commanding. At the close of the war, he was discharged with his character given as excellent, and on the discharge, he will claim citizenship when he leaves the Army long enough to make a settlement. That's quite something. And unfortunately, as we mentioned, he was never naturalized as a U.S. citizen. So something worth really kind of thinking about as we conclude this program here. And, I've read more about him, and people are like, why wasn't he a citizen? Well, obviously he wasn't born in the United States. And then there was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited any immigration of Chinese laborers. I mean, obviously this is decades after the Civil War, and Edward is in the U.S. Army at this time. It also banned, this kind of built on the 1875 law, which banned women from Chinese women from coming to the United States. But I think this is really important to understand that this kind of anti-Asian sentiment and fervor during this period in the post-Civil War era from the 1870s moving up to the early 1900s. So, as a person of Asian descent, and he's claiming where he's from, right? You have to tell him where you're from and who you served with and things like that. And they just simply rejected it. Okay, so I think this is all part of that period there that we still struggle with here today. So in conclusion, I like to call it Civil War to Civil Rights to Citizenship here. I love concluding with Joseph Pierce, of course, really the kind of the standard bearer of soldiers of Asian descent that served in the Civil War. Really quite captivating, a story which really draws people in. And we have the tragic story of Edward Chahota and his decades of military service, which did not equate to citizenship. So the struggle for citizenship continues for many people, of course, right? And but these men really laid a legacy for Asians and Pacific Islanders who served in the American military in World War I and World War II, obviously Korea and Vietnam as well. So really, they were the forerunners in many ways of this next generation, of these succeeding generations of men and women that served in the armed forces of the United States. And I conclude with this gentleman right here. Who is he? Well, you can see the stars on his uniform here, 2-star. He's a major general. But his name is actually Viet Sung Luong, and he's born in Vietnam in 1965. He was the son of a ARVN, or Army of the Republic of Vietnam Army officer. He was a major. In 1975, him and his family obviously fled Saigon from the Saigon airport and made it to the United States. Ended up in one of kind of the relocation relocation camps for Vietnamese refugees. But it's really interesting because he's going to begin this long military career with the United States Army. He goes to USC and does their ROTC program or their junior officer program, and will get a master's there as well. And incredibly, on August 8th, 2014, at Fort Hood, Texas, he becomes the first person born in Vietnam that became a general officer in the United States Army. And then just in 2018, he was promoted to Major General, and he serves as Deputy Commanding General of Operations in Korea or Japan, and he commands what they call the First Corps Forward. So, I'd like to, I started off with Joseph Pearson, my father, and I wanted to conclude with General Luong because I think it's such an inspiration for myself and so many people of Asian descent to see how really how far these people we have come. People of Asian descent have come in this country and serving in the United States military. And I'm honored to work for the National Park Service to wear this uniform. So I hope to meet the general one day. I think it'd be a very special event. All right, thank you so much. If you have any questions, I know I didn't really speak on the defenses of Washington. I'd be more than happy to do it. One of the most heavily fortified cities in the world. You can see our website there, our social media pages, and there's my email at the bottom. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much. I saw some comments there. Let me check them out.
Yeah, so Steve, we do have a couple of comments in there.
Sure.
One comment is just mentioning that Joseph Pierce is buried at Walnut Grove Cemetery, Meridian in New Haven County.
Oh, that's right. He's in New Haven. Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you so
so
much. I appreciate the.
so thank you, Richard, for helping
Yes.
to be able to identify that. And Janet is also asking a question there. In your research, have you identified any Asian Pacific Islander women who disguise themselves as men in order to join the military?
Not yet, and that's a great question, and that's something I've been diving deep into. Not yet though. I'm really interested to see if there's any women of Asian descent that were around the army, because I know there's some. I think a lot of people think about the accounts of women disguising themselves, which I get that, right, and because that's a really cool story. But there
Mhm.
was a lot of women around military camps. Both north and south, especially for the federal armies across the country, because they established, large bases when they occupied ground. And so I learned a lot about that, obviously, at Camp Nelson. You should see what happens in Washington. There are a system of fortifications that completely encircle the Capitol, right? And around the forts themselves are camps, uh, you know, tents and then barracks and all these different structures. And you can imagine during the course of the Civil War, that's going to invite people to come there. Not only like civilians and refugees, which we see a lot of in Washington, including maybe 40,000 formerly enslaved people come to Washington during the Civil War, and they attach themselves to the camps and the forts, and they are hired on as laborers and cooks and servants, including women. So I have found accounts of that. African American women working in the army camps around Washington, and you'll hear that across the country as well, right? Just a practical thing, right? They need to survive and protect, help and feed their families and take care of themselves, right? What about other women? Why I found accounts in Washington of women joining their husbands in the defenses of Washington, because you can imagine it's very relatively static duty, right? I mean, they're there for a certain amount of time, especially if you're in a heavy artillery unit. And I found an account of a woman who joined her husband at one of our forts. They were from New York. He was in the 9th New York Heavy Artillery. And while he was at camp, they actually built the fort, and obviously they trained and operated the cannons there. While she was in camp, she she baked apple pies to supplement their income while in camp, which is absolutely incredible. You don't even think about that, right? That even women would be allowed to come into these camps, especially stay there and live with their husbands. But that happened in 1863. She actually almost died in camp because of disease, and she actually went back to New York. But long answer short, have I found any counts yet? Not yet. Neither have the other historians yet. But I see that as a possibility. If not, but again, as we mentioned as well, just given that number, right? About 37,000 people of Chinese descent in California in 1860, and only 2,000 were women. I mean, that would have been a kind of a hard trek to make it out east. Even in the Trans-Mississippi, right? I mean, who knows? I could see women certainly going to camps and cooking for soldiers, cleaning laundresses. That happened all the time. So, yeah, I'm sure there's accounts we just don't even know about them. And you know what? We may never. Hopefully we can come across something that shows that.
So there's a couple of people thanking you for your presentation, and
Oh,
there's
thank you. I appreciate that.
a couple of other questions here. Any idea of Joseph Pierce Chinese name?
That's a really good question. I thought I had it. Give me a second here. All right, let me look my notes, and I believe he did. I'm trying to recall. There's a lot of names here, of course. I'm trying to recall if he was too young to remember, but I believe he does have it.
Okay, so there's a few more questions here.
Yeah, sure. Please keep on asking.
Was language a barrier for any of these soldiers?
Not from what I've read so far, but I'm sure it was. Yeah, that was not mentioned in some of the things that I have read so far or researched, but I assume it was, especially for people that had not been in the country that long. But that said, think of all the people from Europe that didn't even speak English, right? I mean, there was accounts from a lot of those German and German soldiers that were in the Army of Potomac, and none of them, I mean, a good amount of them didn't even speak English. So, was it a barrier? I think it kind of depended on who they were, but yeah, I'm not exactly sure about that, but I have no doubt it was.
Next one, I believe you did actually talk about this in your presentation, but I'll go ahead and ask it. Did any Asians serve in the Navy?
Yeah, definitely. And according to what we have found, the majority of them served in the navies, especially, which makes sense, right? They're along the coast. They're at the ports. Imagine, if they're in California, and if we talk about, the ones that were in the Gulf Coast or, along the Pacific Ocean, I mean, there were, we believe, dozens and dozens. I mentioned really quickly, just to specifically answer that person's question about the Navy here. I think it's important to call this one specifically out here. As I said, there was, we believe, about a dozen soldiers of Hawaii or Pacific Islanders, right, that served on the USS Santiago de Cuba and saw action at the Second Battle of Fort Fisher in January of 1865, a very critical battle in closing the last major Confederate port. And then apparently about 10 Filipino soldiers served on the CSS Confederate Gaines at the Battle of Mobile Bay in August of 1864.
Another question here. We've had prior speakers talk about California units fighting in the Western territories. Have you found any evidence of Asians fighting with the California units?
That's a really great question, and I've really thought about that as well. Not from what I found yet, but I think, like the California Brigade that served with the Army of the Potomac, right? I have a feeling that there was maybe a few of those gentlemen within I mean, we're talking about a few different regiments. If we have a full brigade, that's about 4 regiments. That's a great question, Jim. Still to be determined, right? The ones that we know for sure that I mentioned, that we have photos of, really served with the Army of the Potomac. Some of them served in the Western armies, with like Sherman and things like that. But I have not found specifically from California, but I would not be surprised if we did. As I said, I think one of the most difficult things for us is just the changing of the names, right? And heck, I understand it personally. My name is Steve. That's not my birth name, right? But it's easy to pronounce, and my Vietnamese name is very difficult to pronounce. So I really understand that, but no, I'm not exactly sure yet. But that's to be determined, and hopefully we'll find out more.
Another question on here. Not too long ago, I read an article regarding Hawaiians who during the Civil War, but most who during the Civil War, I believe, who served during the Civil War, but most of the records are either lost or no longer exist. Can you provide some insight?
Can you read that again, please? There's my email
Sure.
for the person that just asked.
Sure. Not too long ago, I read an article regarding Hawaiians during the Civil War, but most of the records are either lost or no longer exist. Can you provide some insight?
Wow, that's a really great question. I can't provide specific thoughts on that, and I apologize for that. Military records are just hard to maintain in the first place. But I actually haven't heard too much about that, to be honest. The one deep count I have is maybe those soldiers that or the dozen or so soldiers that served on that ship that served out that served near North Carolina. But I don't have any evidence or excuse me, I don't have specific research on Hawaiians and that that specific topic you're talking about. But that's something that I can look forward to. And if you email me, please send me an email, and I'd love to talk to you more about that moving forward. So I think what's important about this is ongoing, right? I mean, research with the Civil War is continuing to evolve, right? And I think one of the most important things is, for me, is these United States colored troops factor as well. So we know of a few gentlemen that's enlisted with the USCT, and we have 180,000 troops that enlisted. That gives us a high probability that there were many more, right? It kind of depends on where you're at, I believe. As I said, I was at Camp Nelson. One of the reasons why it's a national park unit now, it was one of the largest recruitment camps for Black soldiers. 10,000 were raised there, 8 full regiments. And I'm hard pressed to believe that any would be in Kentucky because Kentucky was a slave state and almost everyone that enlisted was enslaved. But who knows? Maybe there was a person that we know people from Kentucky that fled north into Ohio and joined USCT regiments, right? Or went to other states as well. So that's something that we're continuing to develop. And I've got interns actually working on that right now, right? So any other questions?
Yeah, there is actually one coming in off of the phone. So I've been reading the ones that were in the message chat.
Sure.
But certainly if people have questions that they want to be able to voice directly, and there's one coming in off the phone here that And I
Yeah,
don't know.
can you hear me all right?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
Okay, I have two questions. Grand Coulee, Washington, and the Grand Coulee Dam, was that named after the coolies that you talked about? And also the soldier that ended up opening a restaurant but didn't get citizenship, his restaurant burned down. Was there any talk about prejudice because they thought prejudice against Asians? Was that the reason that his place was burned down?
That's a great question, and I haven't found any evidence of that, to be honest. Is that possible? I'm not sure. It seemed like he had spent quite a bit of time in Nebraska after he retired. It looked like he had been there for almost 20 years after his military service. So, I mean, that's a good question, but who knows? You know, I worked in restaurants for 10 years, and those can be pretty dangerous places. Imagine working in a restaurant in 1910, right? So, I mean, I think that's something, and I think the best way to answer that question is we could only find that by looking at newspapers. And I think even with newspapers, right, they'd be like, there was a fire at this guy's restaurant and it burned down, right? I'm sure I'd be hard pressed to be like, well, you know, they went after him for a reason. So who knows? But who knows? I mean, but also out in Nebraska, right? During that period, there's a lot of, you know, anti-Asian sentiment. So that's a possibility there. Apparently he was married to a white woman as well. So that might have caused some friction there. And can you mention those two places that you brought up, sir? I haven't heard of those before.
Yeah, the other one was Grand Coulee, Washington, and the Grand Coulee Dam. Was that named after the coolies that you mentioned?
No, it's spelt differently. So
Yeah, I wasn't sure.
yeah, I don't believe so, sir. But
Okay, thanks very much.
yeah, I don't believe so. Yeah. I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm looking it up on my phone, right? I mean, on my computer right now, and it doesn't appear so.
Okay.
Okay.
Another comment here. It says there was a major fire at the St. Louis archive that may account for the lack of records. I know there was also some at the National Archives for some of the ones for some of the censuses that caused a great loss of records. So I mean that could contribute to the Hawaiian ones as well.
All right, that makes sense. Oh, and I do want to share to answer that gentleman's question on the phone. I just looked this up. The word coulee, this is spelled Coulee, comes from the Canadian French coulis, from the French word couler, meaning to flow, and this is the river. So that actually makes a lot of sense.
Another question here.
Yeah, the coulee for the Chinese was Coolie. Yep.
Thank you, Steve. Since you are back in Washington, have you been out to Ox Hill to see the Korean Civil War Trail sign?
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's a great question. My friend Drew Gruber, the director, is actually a really good friend of mine, and so he was very excited about that. I was very proud of him to put that together. He reached out to me, because he's like, "Hey, do you know anyone that is fluent and can read Korean?" And so we kind of went back and forth to find someone that could read the text to make sure everything was correct. He actually texted me before this program saying good luck. So I did see it. It's a great site. I don't believe there's Civil War trails in California. That'd be quite the drive for Drew Gruber, but yeah, no, it's great. You know, Drew describes Civil War trails as the largest like outdoor museum in like the country. So I think that's a great description. There's like 3,000 waysides. So yeah, no, they had kind of like a little grand open. I mean, like a grand review a couple weeks ago, and obviously that's a very, there's a lot of Koreans in the community in that area, and I think it's going to become even more and more popular, which is quite exciting. And I'll share this as well. Do more research on Joseph Pierce. We know that he was in DC. He was sick at some point in 1862 after he enlisted, and this is before the Battle of Chancellorsville. Also, Old Baldy Civil War Roundtable sponsored the sign. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. He also they were around the defenses of Washington. They were across the across the Potomac River in Arlington. So I've gone out to some of the forts where the 14th Connecticut was around. I'm like, oh my gosh, Joseph Pierce was around this area. So it's quite exciting. And I hope I can come back at some point to present about the Civil War defenses of Washington. I think people would be shocked about, how complex and elaborate they were, and how many different people they attracted throughout the course of the war and afterwards. So thank you so much. I appreciate everyone's time. It was always a pleasure to speak to Civil War Roundtable. I think this is the furthest west I've spoken to anyone. So I see it's 8:30 there. It's 11:30 in Washington, D.C. But again, it's been a pleasure to present to you. I'm not Gary Gallagher, but he did go to school in Colorado. So you can tell him that I'm his leadoff hitter, okay? Because it's hard presenting before that guy, that's for sure. He's one of a kind.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate your presentation tonight.
I think Gary Gallagher grew up in Colorado.
That's right, he did. He grew up and he went to Adams State. So obviously he's one of the best. And so I've had the fortune to meet him once before, and I'm sure you'll enjoy his presentations. It's the last few days of Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, so it's been an honor to present. Obviously, it's been a difficult year for a lot of people of Asian descent in the United States and across the world. So I appreciate the time to present on this very, very important topic, and just the idea of Asian and Pacific Islanders and their really role in the development of this country, and their involvement in really some of our most important events. So again, I'm very honored, and I appreciate the time, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Steve.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Take care, okay?
Bye.